The city of Riga, perched on the banks of the Daugava River, was a place of stark contrasts in the 17th century, a city divided not just by wealth and poverty, but by an invisible, yet unyielding, barrier of social hierarchy. The streets near the city square gleamed with polished cobblestones, reflecting the laughter and music of festival preparations, while the outskirts whispered tales of hardship, hunger, and unrelenting toil. In the weeks leading up to the festival, the air was thick with anticipation among the noble families, who meticulously planned elaborate feasts, dances, and displays of wealth. For them, the festival was more than tradition. It was a stage, a chance to flaunt power, influence, and the opulent lives they had inherited from generations past. Crystal goblets, silk gowns, and gilded masks would soon shimmer under lantern light, illuminating the faces of those who had always ruled without question. Yet, beneath this veneer of celebration, a darker reality festered, one that few dared to speak aloud. The peasants, who formed the backbone of Riga's society, moved through life in a vastly different rhythm. Their days began before dawn and ended long after the last rays of sun vanished behind the spires of the city's churches. Fields that produced food for the tables of the elite were tilled by calloused hands, yet the harvests often left the laborers with barely enough to survive. Many families lived in cramped, wooden cottages, shivering through the bitter winters, plagued by disease, and bound by the invisible chains of debt and feudal obligation. Every festival, which the nobility celebrated with gaiety and excess, was a reminder of the chasm that separated the rulers from the ruled. To the peasants, these occasions were not just displays of wealth. They were humiliations, reinforcing the cruel certainty that the world had been designed for others, leaving them to endure. Rumors had begun to swirl in the weeks before the festival. Whispers of discontent drifted through taverns, blacksmith shops, and hidden gatherings in the forests beyond the city walls. Some spoke in hushed tones of the relentless demands imposed by landlords, the unjust taxation, and the merciless punishments for the smallest offenses. Others shared stories of families torn apart, of children sent to beg for scraps in exchange for debts they could never repay. Among these whispers were the seeds of a growing rebellion, subtle at first, like embers glowing beneath a layer of ash, waiting for the wind to fan them into flame. No one could predict the violence that simmered quietly beneath Riga's festive surface, and yet, some sensed that this year would be different. It was not merely material deprivation that fueled the simmering anger. It was the daily indignities that wore away at the human spirit. The nobility, confident in their superiority, often mocked the peasants openly, ridiculing their dress, their accents, even their customs. The city council, composed entirely of wealthy merchants and landowners, rarely acknowledged the suffering beyond their mansions. Justice in Riga was a privilege, not a right. Courts were slow, biased, and cruel, and punishments were meted out in a manner designed more to instill fear than to correct wrongdoing. Children witnessed these injustices and internalized them, learning from an early age that their lives were predetermined, their fates bound by the whims of those with power. It was an environment where bitterness could take root easily, and indeed, it had. Among the peasants, a few individuals stood out, not by their wealth or status, but by their quiet defiance and sharp minds. They observed patterns in the behavior of the ruling class, noting weaknesses, opportunities, and moments when the arrogance of the elite might be turned against them. They met in secret, sometimes in barns or in the shadowy corners of forests, exchanging stories, grievances, and plans. These were not idle fantasies. They were strategies formed in desperation, born from generations of oppression. Their conversations were laced with urgency and fear, yet also with a sense of possibility, a dangerous hope that the balance of power could be overturned, if only for a day. The festival itself, a tradition that had been celebrated for decades, became an unwitting catalyst for the events to come. What was meant to be a day of joy and community for the city would soon be remembered as a day of unimaginable bloodshed. The preparations of the nobility, from the selection of the finest meats and wines to the commissioning of musicians and dancers, contrasted sharply with the clandestine gatherings of the peasants, who sharpened tools, rehearsed silent signals, and mentally rehearsed the moment when grievances would turn into action. There was a symmetry in this contrast, almost cinematic in its cruelty. The glittering pageantry of privilege overshadowed by the simmering rage of those whose lives it had trampled. Even the environment seemed to echo the city's duality. The sun might shine brilliantly over the river and the spires, yet shadows lingered in the narrow alleys and around the edges of the marketplace. The wind carried both the laughter of children chasing after festival balloons and the whispered conversations of adults planning vengeance. It was as if Riga itself held its breath, aware that something unprecedented was about to unfold, though no one could articulate exactly what. The tension was palpable, invisible yet omnipresent, creating a sense of anticipation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. By the eve of the festival, the city existed in a precarious balance, a fragile dance between celebration and catastrophe. Nobles rehearsed their toasts and dances, unaware of the storm gathering beyond their gates. Peasants readied themselves, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear, anger, and grim determination. And in this space between expectation and disaster, Riga stood on the precipice of history, a city poised to witness an eruption of violence that would be whispered about for generations, yet largely forgotten by the annals of official history. The shadows before the festival were deep and foreboding, and when the first acts of rebellion finally ignited, no one could have predicted the scale or the horror of what was to come. The tension that would eventually explode on Festival Day in Riga had been building quietly for generations. The peasants' suffering was both relentless and normalized, their lives dictated by a system designed to strip them of agency, dignity, and hope. The feudal lords ruled with an iron fist, enforcing labor demands that left the population exhausted and malnourished. Every misstep, no matter how minor, was met with disproportionate punishment, fines, beatings, or public humiliation. Children grew up witnessing these injustices, learning early that authority was synonymous with cruelty, and that compliance was the only path to survival. Over time, this constant oppression fermented into a collective resentment, a quiet but pervasive hatred that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. The seeds of rebellion were sown through personal suffering as much as systemic injustice. Stories of families stripped of everything for failing to meet a landlord's demands circulated among villages, retold in hushed tones over meager meals. One peasant family lost their home and livestock simply because they could not pay an inflated grain tax. Another watched helplessly as a father returned from punishment with broken bones, unable to work yet still expected to toil. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns of abuse that created a shared consciousness of injustice. Each act of cruelty reinforced the hierarchy, but it also left an indelible mark on the psyche of those who endured it. The peasants' rage was cumulative, layered over decades, and became almost a living entity, growing stronger with each new injustice. Secret networks of communication formed as a survival mechanism. Peasants shared information about abusive landlords, hidden caches of food, and discreet strategies for avoiding punishment. Small acts of defiance, refusing to pay a minor fee, hiding tools, or speaking out, were dangerous yet emboldening. They created a sense of agency in a world designed to suppress it. Within these networks, ideas about resistance began to circulate. Older villagers recounted tales of uprisings crushed in the past, not as cautionary tales alone, but as templates for planning, learning from the mistakes of those who had tried and failed. These stories became part of the collective memory, shaping both the strategy and the psychology of rebellion. Amid this backdrop of suffering, natural leaders began to emerge. These were individuals who possessed intelligence, charisma, or simply the courage to speak against the system. They became focal points for organizing, coordinating secret meetings, and conveying plans in whispers that traveled from cottage to cottage. These leaders were often the most deeply scarred by the injustices they had endured personally, and their anger became a galvanizing force for others. They understood that a successful revolt required more than brute strength. It required careful observation, patience, and a profound understanding of both the oppressor's vulnerabilities and the oppressed's own fears. The psychological impact of oppression cannot be overstated. For the peasants, life was defined by humiliation, deprivation, and the constant reminder that they were disposable in the eyes of the elite. Festivals, intended as displays of noble generosity, were instead agonizing symbols of exclusion. Nobles dined on delicacies while peasants scavenged for scraps. Children were mocked, adults belittled, and any attempt at social mobility punished harshly. These repeated experiences fostered a collective identity rooted in suffering and simmering hatred. It was an identity that demanded acknowledgement, that refused to be contained indefinitely, and that would eventually find its violent expression. By the time the festival approached, the psychological groundwork for rebellion had been firmly established. Anger and despair had transformed into determination and planning. The peasants had studied the routines of the nobles, identified weak points in their security, and developed both logistical strategies and mental preparedness for the violence to come. The hatred, cultivated over generations, had matured into a focused force, ready to be unleashed. It was not a spontaneous act of fury, but the culmination of years of observation, discussion, and suppressed emotion, all converging on a single day. The seeds of hatred, once invisible, were now ready to bear fruit. The peasants of Riga were no longer merely victims of circumstance. They had become active participants in their own story of vengeance. Each step toward the festival, each whispered word of coordination, carried with it the weight of decades of oppression and the hope, terrifying and exhilarating, of finally overturning the social order. The rebellion, when it came, would not be a random outburst. It would be the inevitable manifestation of hatred cultivated by injustice, a brutal reminder that human endurance has limits and that systemic cruelty can provoke unimaginable consequences. The festival day dawned over Riga with an almost deceptive serenity. Golden sunlight glinted off the river, reflecting the bustling life of a city unaware of the storm gathering in its midst. The air was fragrant with the scent of fresh bread, roasted meats, and flowers meticulously arranged by the noble families for the celebrations. Merchants lined the streets with stalls full of colorful fabrics, hand-carved trinkets, and delicacies meant to impress visiting dignitaries. Children ran gleefully along the cobblestones, their laughter ringing out across the city square, while musicians tuned their instruments in preparation for the grand parade. Everything appeared festive, innocent, even joyful, but beneath this surface lay a tension that could not be ignored. Among the peasants, the morning was marked not by celebration but by an almost ceremonial preparation for what was to come. They moved quietly through alleys, under the pretense of normal work, carrying sharpened tools hidden beneath cloaks, and exchanging silent gestures of recognition. The air for them was thick with anticipation, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear, anger, and grim determination. Every step toward the square was a step toward the unimaginable, an act that would shatter the city's illusion of order. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses, yet all shared the same understanding. This day would not end as it had in previous years. The contrast could not have been starker. While nobles adorned themselves in silk, velvet, and lace, discussing the evening's festivities over crystal goblets, the peasants concealed their weapons and their intent beneath the rags of daily toil. The city square, brimming with music and laughter, became a stage for an impending drama whose final act had been long rehearsed in secret. As the parade began, with banners waving and drums echoing against the stone facades, those who would later commit the massacre moved invisibly among the crowd, their eyes scanning for signals, their minds calculating the precise moment to strike. The juxtaposition of jubilation and simmering rage created a tension that was almost tangible, a silent drumbeat that foreshadowed violence. And then, with terrifying suddenness, the fragile illusion shattered. The first act of rebellion erupted as a single peasant lunged from the crowd, striking a noble with a concealed blade. The shock was instantaneous. Laughter and music froze mid-note. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Nobles, previously secure in the assumption that their privilege rendered them untouchable, were now confronted with raw, unbridled rage. Panic spread like wildfire. The square, once a symbol of order and celebration, became a theater of chaos. Shouts echoed off the walls, mingling with the sounds of scuffling feet, breaking glass, and terrified screams. The attack was not random, but calculated. The leaders of the revolt had orchestrated every movement, each action choreographed to maximize surprise and impact. Peasants struck with improvised weapons, axes, clubs, knives, and with a precision born from months of clandestine planning. Nobles attempted to defend themselves, but they were overwhelmed, unprepared for the coordinated fury that had been hidden in plain sight. Some tried to flee toward the city gates, only to find their paths blocked by rebels who had anticipated every route. The chaos was both brutal and mesmerizing, a terrifying ballet of vengeance executed with grim determination. Eyewitnesses later described the scene with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The air, once fragrant with festival foods and flowers, now reeked of smoke, blood, and fear. Horses bolted through the streets, their hooves clattering against stone as frightened riders abandoned both steed and dignity. Servants fled, dragging their masters when possible, or leaving them to the mercy of enraged peasants. The city's musicians, caught in the crossfire, dropped their instruments, some fleeing with frantic desperation, others struck down without mercy. Every corner of the square seemed to host a tableau of violence, each more shocking than the last. Yet even in the midst of carnage, there was a chilling sense of order. The peasants did not attack indiscriminately. Their fury was directed at the nobility, the symbols of oppression who had caused their suffering for generations. Houses of prominent families were stormed, gates broken, doors forced open, and rooms searched with relentless determination. Some nobles were dragged from the safety of their homes, others cornered in public spaces, all meeting the wrath of those who had been forced to live in silence for far too long. The violence, as horrifying as it was, had a strange logic to it, a grim narrative of retribution that the peasants seemed determined to see fulfilled. Amid the chaos, moments of surreal humanity emerged. A peasant paused to spare a servant or a child, recognizing that the hand of vengeance was not meant for the innocent. Others hesitated as they confronted neighbors who had joined the side of the oppressors, torn between loyalty and rage. These fleeting acts of mercy or hesitation only heightened the suspense, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human conscience could not be entirely extinguished. Every pause, every split-second decision, added layers of drama to an already nightmarish day. The massacre continued through the afternoon, a relentless storm of fury and fear. Nobles attempted to regroup, calling for guards and militia, but the speed and coordination of the peasants' attacks made resistance almost futile. The square, once a place of music, dance, and celebration, had become a landscape of horror. Broken banners fluttered in the wind, mingling with the cries of the dying and the terrified. The festival, intended to glorify wealth and tradition, now immortalized suffering and rage. Witnesses later recalled the surreal contrast. Sunlight reflected off gilded masks as blood spilled onto cobblestones, a grotesque tableau of light and darkness intertwined. By evening, the first stage of the massacre had reached its peak. The city, still reeling from the shock, was silent in places where music had once played. Fires smoldered, signaling both destruction and triumph, as the rebels regrouped and assessed the impact of their actions. Though the initial fury had passed, the psychological weight of the day lingered, etching itself into the collective memory of those who had witnessed it. Riga had transformed in hours from a city of celebration to a city marked by vengeance, terror, and irreversible change. The massacre had left Riga in a state of stunned silence, a city once vibrant with celebration now steeped in smoke, blood, and the echoes of terror. As the initial chaos subsided, the scale of what had occurred became horrifyingly clear. Streets were littered with the bodies of nobles and servants alike, some mutilated in the frenzy, others lying still as if in suspended disbelief. The opulence that had defined the festival was now marred by destruction. Overturned tables, shattered goblets, trampled fabrics, and broken ornaments. The air was thick with the stench of iron and fear, a stark reminder that the city's carefully constructed hierarchy had been violently dismantled, if only for a day. The peasants themselves were not untouched by the day's horrors. Though they had acted with vengeance in their hearts, the sight of death, the screams of the dying, and the weight of what they had unleashed pressed heavily upon them. Some wandered through the streets in shock, dazed by the scope of their own actions. Others confronted their neighbors, faces pale and trembling, as the realization of what they had done settled like a heavy stone on their consciences. Despite their suffering under centuries of oppression, the act of slaughtering those who had wielded power with cruelty brought both a sense of release and a chilling awareness of the human cost of their rebellion. For the nobles who survived the initial onslaught, the massacre was a nightmare made flesh. Families who had once believed themselves untouchable found themselves cornered, hiding in attics or behind locked doors, hearing the sound of footsteps and angry voices outside. Servants who had once been companions in the grand halls were now powerless observers of their master's demise. Some nobles attempted to fight back, wielding whatever weapons they could grasp, but the coordinated fury of the peasants was overwhelming. Each failed defense, each futile struggle, further emphasized the vulnerability of a class that had long assumed it was invincible. Pride, power, and wealth offered no protection against the raw force of pent-up rage. Amid the carnage, the question of morality began to surface, even among the rebels. Some peasants paused in the midst of violence, considering whether to strike at a child or a helpless servant. Others grappled with the ethics of vengeance, questioning whether their actions were justified or if they had become monsters themselves. The boundary between justice and cruelty blurred in those tense moments. Psychological studies of violence often suggest that revenge is both exhilarating and terrifying, a duality that the peasants of Riga experienced acutely. Their triumph was shadowed by guilt, fear, and the haunting awareness that the city would never be the same again. Historians who later studied the event noted the precision of the attacks, almost surgical in their execution. Despite the chaos, there was method in the madness. The peasants had targeted the elite deliberately, focusing on those whose wealth, privilege, and cruelty had caused generations of suffering. Homes of prominent families were systematically breached, valuables destroyed or looted, and symbolic acts of defiance performed to leave a message. It was not mindless slaughter. It was carefully orchestrated retribution, a statement carved into the streets and buildings of Riga that the oppressed could no longer be ignored. The massacre, in its horrifying logic, became a narrative of resistance written in blood. Yet even in the midst of action, survival instincts prevailed. Some peasants protected one another, ensuring that the coordinated effort did not descend into indiscriminate violence. In quiet corners, fleeting moments of humanity appeared, a shared glance of empathy, a whispered word of comfort, a pause to help someone wounded. These small acts, though overshadowed by the enormity of the massacre, highlighted the complex psychology of those who commit violence under extreme circumstances. Rage and morality, despair and compassion coexisted uneasily, creating a layered, almost cinematic portrait of human behavior under extreme stress. The local populace, who were not directly involved in the rebellion, responded with a mixture of awe, horror, and fear. Onlookers described streets choked with fleeing nobles and armed peasants, the cacophony of shouts and cries echoing for hours. Many who witnessed the massacre later recounted the surreal contrast between the city's outward beauty and the scenes of horror that unfolded within it. Some citizens fled to neighboring towns, fearing retaliation, while others remained, compelled to observe the unraveling of a world they had taken for granted. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate participants, reshaping collective memory and embedding a sense of caution, superstition, and unease that would linger for decades. The aftermath of the first day's violence revealed stark truths about Riga's society. Power, long assumed to be absolute, was fragile in the face of collective action. The nobility, accustomed to unquestioned authority, discovered that the veneer of control could be shattered in hours by those they had marginalized. At the same time, the peasants learned the intoxicating and dangerous potential of rebellion, the thrill of asserting agency and exacting vengeance. But these lessons came with a heavy price. Even victorious peasants faced psychological scars. The sights, sounds, and smells of violence lingered, haunting dreams and conversations, a reminder that even justice could be cruel and consuming. As night fell over Riga, the city was transformed. Fires smoldered where torches had ignited, The streets echoed with the distant sounds of mourning, and the bodies of the dead lay where they had fallen, a chilling testament to the day's events. Peasants retreated to hidden corners to recover, plan the next stages of their revolt, or simply come to terms with what they had done. Nobles who survived were left to reckon with a sudden vulnerability they had never before imagined. The festival, intended to celebrate wealth, tradition, and social cohesion, had instead revealed the precariousness of power and the volatility of suppressed rage. By the time silence returned, Riga bore the scars of both physical destruction and psychological upheaval. The massacre had demonstrated the duality of human nature: cruelty and compassion, fear and courage, despair and hope, all intertwined within a single, darkly charged day. It was a day that would be remembered in whispers, in clandestine accounts, and in the shadows of collective memory, leaving a legacy of both horror and revelation. In the streets of Riga, the blood of the massacre was more than a mark of vengeance. It was a symbol of the consequences of oppression left unchecked, a warning encoded into the city's history that would haunt generations to come. In the aftermath of the festival massacre, Riga's authorities were plunged into a state of panic and disbelief. The noble families, once secure in their social dominance, were now scattered, injured, or dead, and the city itself seemed unrecognizable. The governing council, composed of the surviving elite, convened hastily in the dimly lit chambers of the city hall, their faces pale with fear and outrage. For the first time, they confronted a terrifying truth. Their power was not invincible, and the peasants they had long dismissed as obedient laborers had demonstrated both cunning and lethal force. The council's deliberations were frantic, a mixture of anger, fear, and the urgent need to restore order before the city descended into chaos entirely. Immediately, efforts were made to organize a systematic hunt for the rebels. Guards and militia were mobilized, checkpoints were established at the city gates, and orders were given to search every home, tavern, and barn in the outskirts. The surviving nobles, some still trembling from the shock, personally oversaw squads of armed men, pointing out known conspirators or suspected sympathizers. The hunt was brutal and unrelenting. No one was safe, and suspicion extended to neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives. The fear of retaliation created a climate of terror that spread as widely as the memory of the massacre itself. In this atmosphere, every shadow, every whispered conversation became a potential threat, and the city braced for further bloodshed. The peasants, though victorious in the immediate aftermath of the festival, were acutely aware of the danger they faced. Many had hoped that their act of vengeance would be fleeting, a singular eruption of rage that would leave the city trembling but intact. They were now confronted with the inevitable. The machinery of justice, swift and merciless, would descend upon them. Those who had fled to the forests or hidden within barns watched as the authorities combed through their neighborhoods, interrogating anyone suspected of involvement. Betrayal was common. Fear drove neighbors to turn on one another in an attempt to secure their own survival. The climate of suspicion fractured communities that had once been united in quiet anger, exposing the fragile bonds of trust forged under oppression. The capture of rebels was often violent. Guards would storm cottages at dawn, battering doors with mallets or axes, dragging men, women, and sometimes even children into the streets. Resistance was met with immediate and overwhelming force, a brutal demonstration of the authority that had been temporarily shattered. Captives were bound, their faces bruised, and paraded through the city as a warning. The spectacle was intended to reassert dominance, to remind both the survivors and the wider populace that the nobility's power, though shaken, remained absolute. Yet in some cases, the sight of captured peasants, bloodied, defiant, or terrified, elicited unexpected sympathy from townspeople who quietly questioned the morality of punishing the oppressed for fighting back. Trials followed swiftly, though they were far from fair. The judicial process, dominated entirely by the elite, was designed less to determine truth than to deliver punishment and restore social order. Accused rebels were interrogated under duress, often beaten or threatened until confessions were obtained. Witnesses, frequently coerced, provided testimony that justified executions rather than uncovering actual guilt. The trials were public spectacles, held in the city square to maximize their impact on the wider population. From the moment a peasant was brought before the judges, the outcome was effectively predetermined. The process was a performance of justice, designed to impress upon all that rebellion was both futile and deadly. Executions were carried out with calculated cruelty. Men were hanged, women whipped and imprisoned, and some were subjected to more gruesome punishments meant to leave a lasting impression on the city. Public humiliation accompanied physical torment, as a warning to anyone who might entertain similar thoughts of vengeance. The very streets that had witnessed the uprising became a theater for demonstrating the restoration of order, turning tragedy into a grotesque performance of authority. The authorities believed that terror would deter further rebellion, and indeed, the psychological impact on the wider population was profound. Children who had witnessed the executions would carry the memory into adulthood, internalizing lessons of obedience and fear. Despite the overwhelming response, not all rebels were captured immediately. Some disappeared into forests, neighboring towns, or distant lands, carrying with them the memory of the massacre and a mixture of pride and dread. Their escape only added to the mythos of the rebellion, creating whispered stories of cunning peasants who had momentarily defied the natural order. These stories, recounted in hushed tones around fireplaces or in secretive gatherings, kept the memory of the festival alive, embedding it in folklore even as the official narrative sought to erase it. The duality of fear and admiration created a complex legacy that would endure long after the physical hunt had ended. The response of the authorities also highlighted the fragility of social cohesion in Riga. Nobles who had previously assumed loyalty from their servants and peasants now realized that obedience was conditional, dependent on fear rather than respect. Communities were torn apart as suspicion spread, and trust, once the quiet glue of daily life, was replaced with paranoia. This breakdown of social bonds served the authorities in the short term, reinforcing control through terror, but it also left deep scars in the fabric of the city. The psychological consequences were as significant as the physical damage inflicted by the massacre itself. By the end of the hunt and punishment, Riga had been reshaped. The immediate threat of rebellion had been suppressed, and the nobility had reasserted their authority, but the city bore permanent marks of the events that had unfolded. Fear, resentment, and cautious respect for collective action lingered among the peasants, while the elite's sense of invulnerability had been irrevocably shaken. The festival massacre and the subsequent hunt had demonstrated both the consequences of oppression and the fragility of power. Riga would never forget the day the peasants rose, nor the brutal response that followed, a dark lesson etched into the streets, the homes, and the hearts of all who lived through it. As the smoke of the festival massacre cleared and Riga returned to its uneasy semblance of normalcy, the event itself began to fade from the official historical record. Despite its scale and the terror it had unleashed, the massacre was largely omitted from the chronicles of the city's elite. Historians of the time, most of them affiliated with the noble class or working under their influence, framed the events as a regrettable disruption, a brief eruption of disorder caused by unruly peasants rather than a consequence of systemic injustice. The narrative was sanitized, stripped of the pain, oppression, and calculated vengeance that had fueled the uprising. In effect, the rebellion was erased, relegated to whispers, rumors, and the faint shadows of oral history passed down through families. This selective memory served multiple purposes. For the ruling class, it restored the illusion of control, allowing them to present themselves as the rightful arbiters of justice and morality. For the peasants who survived, it meant that their act of defiance became both a source of pride and a source of frustration. They had risked everything to strike back at centuries of oppression, yet the very history they had fought to create was suppressed, rewritten, and forgotten by those who wielded the pen as powerfully as they had wielded weapons. In private homes and among close-knit communities, however, stories persisted. Parents whispered tales of courage and vengeance to their children, passing down the memory of a day when the powerless momentarily overturned the natural order. These stories became the invisible thread connecting generations, a subtle rebellion against historical erasure. The physical city bore marks of the massacre for decades. Burned buildings, damaged gates, and scuffed streets served as silent reminders of the violence that had erupted. Local lore began to develop around these scars. Legends spoke of shadows that moved through abandoned houses, of ghostly figures wandering the streets where nobles had fallen, and of unspoken warnings whispered by the wind along the riverbanks. In these tales, the massacre was elevated from a historical event to a symbol, a mythic representation of injustice and resistance. The Peasants' Uprising, though officially forgotten, persisted in cultural memory as a cautionary and haunting tale, a story that warned of the consequences of oppression left unchecked. Yet the psychological echoes of the massacre were even more profound than its physical remnants. Among survivors, both noble and peasant, the trauma persisted in forms that historians rarely acknowledged. Nobles who had escaped the violence carried a heightened sense of vulnerability, aware for the first time that their assumed superiority could be violently challenged. They became more cautious, more paranoid, and more eager to suppress any sign of dissent in the years that followed. For the peasants, memories of the day were a mixture of pride and guilt. They had achieved the impossible, yet the aftermath, the hunt, the executions, the betrayals, and the fear was a heavy burden. Sleep was haunted by visions of the dying. Conversations were laced with caution, and communities were fractured by suspicion and fear of reprisals. The massacre, though fleeting in its immediate action, left permanent psychological scars. Over time, the event also shaped the city's social and cultural fabric in subtler ways. Laws became slightly harsher, designed to prevent even minor signs of insurrection, while festivals and public gatherings were monitored more closely by authorities. Nobles became more deliberate in their displays of power, seeking to maintain control through a combination of intimidation and spectacle. In private, peasants spoke less openly, internalizing fear even as they preserved memories of the uprising through storytelling. The massacre's legacy thus became paradoxical, a symbol of both the possibility of resistance and the enduring power of authority to suppress and reshape memory. Historians who later studied Riga, often centuries removed from the event, faced significant challenges in reconstructing what had happened. Official records were incomplete, biased, or deliberately misleading. Archaeological evidence provided glimpses of destruction but could not fully convey the human stories, the emotions, or the psychological complexity of the day. Oral histories offered fragments of truth, vivid in detail but inconsistent in scope, requiring careful interpretation to separate fact from embellishment. The task of uncovering the massacre became an exercise in detective work, piecing together the faint traces left behind by those who had lived through fear, violence, and retaliation. Each fragment revealed not only the scale of the events, but also the resilience of memory, persisting even when official narratives sought to erase it. The massacre also provided a lens through which future generations could examine human behavior under extreme oppression. It revealed the consequences of social inequality, the latent power of collective action, and the psychological complexities of vengeance. Even though it had been suppressed in the annals of official history, its lessons were enduring. Stories of bravery, cruelty, fear, and resilience were passed from parent to child, shaping cultural understanding of justice and morality. In this sense, the massacre survived not as a mere historical footnote, but as a living narrative, embedded in the consciousness of Riga's people and echoing into the wider history of human society. By the time centuries had passed, the event became known primarily through fragments, the whispers of forgotten witnesses, and the cautionary tales embedded in local culture. Its name, the Festival Massacre, might have faded from textbooks, yet its impact lingered in Riga's architecture, traditions, and collective psyche. It was a dark story, often untold, that highlighted the dangers of inequality, the consequences of neglecting the suffering of the powerless, and the profound ways in which history could be shaped not just by those who wielded power, but by those who dared to challenge it, even briefly. In the end, the Forgotten Massacre of Riga existed in the shadow between recorded history and legend, a story of vengeance, suffering, and memory. Its echoes were quiet but persistent, a reminder that even acts deemed insignificant or inconvenient by the powerful can leave an indelible mark on culture, consciousness, and the human understanding of justice. Though largely absent from official records, the massacre lived on in whispered narratives, lingering fears, and the persistent, haunting memory of a day when the oppressed rose, if only for a fleeting moment, to rewrite the rules of power. The massacre of Riga was not merely a historical incident. It was a reflection of human nature, of society's structures, and of the delicate balance between power and resistance. While the event itself unfolded over a single, violent day, its implications stretched far beyond the immediate destruction, extending into the psychological, moral, and cultural fabric of the city. At its core, the massacre highlighted the dangers inherent in unchecked authority and the volatile consequences of prolonged oppression. The nobles, so confident in their supremacy, had ignored the simmering resentment that had grown like an invisible storm cloud over their city. By dismissing the voices of the oppressed, they inadvertently sowed the seeds of their own downfall, demonstrating the fragility of dominance built solely on fear and tradition. The story of the peasants was equally instructive, though far more complex. Their rebellion was born of desperation, anger, and centuries of suffering, yet it also revealed the darker dimensions of human nature. When ordinary people are pushed to the edge, their actions can swing between heroic and horrifying, between the pursuit of justice and the infliction of indiscriminate harm. In Riga, the peasants' fury was directed at those responsible for their misery, yet the line between vengeance and cruelty blurred with every act of violence. This duality, of moral righteousness and brutal retribution, serves as a reminder that historical events are rarely black and white. They are colored by the emotions, intentions, and fears of those who live them. One of the most haunting lessons of the massacre lies in the power of memory and its suppression. Despite the enormity of the events, the massacre was largely erased from official records, relegated to whispers and fragmented oral histories. This deliberate forgetting illustrates how history is often written by the victors, sanitized and reshaped to serve prevailing narratives. The peasants' victory, brief though it was, left a legacy that could not be fully documented or celebrated, yet its psychological impact persisted. Future generations would inherit both the fear instilled by authority and the knowledge, passed quietly from parent to child, that resistance, even fleeting and suppressed, was possible. The massacre, therefore, was a lesson not just in power or violence, but in the fragility of recorded history and the resilience of memory. The psychological echoes of the massacre extend beyond its immediate participants. Survivors on both sides carried trauma that shaped their perceptions, decisions, and relationships for years to come. The nobles learned vulnerability. The peasants learned the intoxicating yet haunting consequences of rebellion. Communities were fractured, trust was eroded, and a culture of caution, fear, and secrecy took root. These lingering effects underscore the profound ways in which acts of violence reverberate across generations. The massacre was not merely a historical event. It was a transformative force that altered the social and emotional architecture of Riga, influencing behavior, beliefs, and interpersonal dynamics for decades. Moreover, the event serves as a cautionary tale for modern audiences. It illustrates how systemic inequality, neglect of the vulnerable, and unaddressed grievances can accumulate into catastrophic outcomes. Social hierarchies, when rigid and exploitative, create conditions in which rebellion becomes inevitable. The peasants' actions were extreme, yet they were the logical consequence of sustained injustice. In a broader sense, Riga's massacre is a stark reminder that societies ignoring inequality and oppression do so at their peril. It is a testament to the idea that human beings, when pushed beyond endurance, will act to reclaim agency, even if that act is violent, morally ambiguous, or fleetingly successful. The massacre also invites reflection on the ethical dimensions of revenge and justice. While the peasants' fury was understandable, the indiscriminate violence and terror inflicted upon the city complicates any simple moral judgment. Revenge provided immediate satisfaction, but also brought psychological and social consequences that extended far beyond the day of action. Authority, when misused, inevitably provokes reactions that are equally complex and far-reaching. History, therefore, presents a nuanced lesson. The pursuit of justice, when intertwined with personal and collective vengeance, produces outcomes that are rarely neat, rarely fully comprehensible, and often morally unsettling. Finally, the story of Riga's massacre underscores the importance of empathy, awareness, and historical reflection. The event challenges us to consider the perspectives of both the oppressed and the oppressors, to understand the conditions that lead ordinary people to extraordinary actions. It reminds us that human behavior is shaped not only by circumstance, but by cumulative experience, memory, and the choices of individuals in the crucible of history. By studying events such as this, we gain insight into the recurring patterns of human society, the rise and fall of power, the consequences of inequality, and the haunting persistence of memory. The massacre of Riga, forgotten though it may be in official accounts, continues to resonate as a dark yet profoundly instructive episode of history. It serves as a mirror reflecting both the capacity for oppression and the potential for resistance, the duality of human nature and the enduring consequences of our actions. It challenges us to acknowledge the unseen struggles of those relegated to the margins of society, to recognize the consequences of injustice, and to reflect on the moral complexities that define historical events. Ultimately, the lesson from the shadows is clear. Power is never absolute. Memory is resilient, and the consequences of human anger, if left unchecked, are both inevitable and unforgettable. In remembering Riga's forgotten massacre, we confront not only a past filled with horror and vengeance, but also timeless truths about society, morality, and human nature. It is a story that transcends its immediate context, urging us to examine the forces that shape our world, the structures that oppress, and the choices that define the course of history. The shadows of that day continue to linger, whispering their lessons to anyone willing to listen, a reminder that even in darkness, understanding and reflection can illuminate the human condition.